Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I hear there's a lot of discussion going on, but I really want, we have a busy schedule ahead, as I said. So I'd like to turn now to the first panel discussion. First, I'd like to point you to the message wall. So during the panel discussions, you can point your questions and remarks. You can post them on the message wall. The hashtag will be also in your program, but it is hashtag Chemicals Forum. We will encourage you, of course, to do that, because that will make the discussion more lively. The panel discussion, we first start with the presentations. Then there will be a panel discussion of half an hour, and then we will turn to the audience to your questions. And then I hope it will be a lively discussion. We encourage you to participate in those discussions. Now I would like to introduce the first panel to you, and it will be moderated by Otto Linher. He's Deputy Head of REACH Unit at DG GROW, the European Commission. And he will speak with his panelists. He will introduce the panelists, and he will speak about how to choose the best possible risk management option to regulate substances of very high concern. I hope you enjoy.
Thank you very much. It's a bit an unusual role for me to be a moderator of a panel. I'm much more used to chairing REACH committees and Caracal meetings. So there's a slightly different setting, but the good thing is that it's still on regulatory risk management, which is my job. So just to introduce the subject, so regulatory risk management is basically the question, what can regulators and what can legislation do to improve risk management, to help industry to do their job, sometimes also a little bit forcing industry to do the job. And then a lot of this, of the panel today will be about the choice of options. That means which options do we have to use regulation, to use legislation to improve risk management. There is a focus on authorization, which is an EU specific thing, but it's not only about authorization. So we're trying to put authorization in perspective in relation to other risk management options, such as restrictions, occupational safety and health legislation, environmental legislation, and so on. So why do we choose authorization? Does it work? So that's one of the focuses. But again, there is a focus on the EU, but not only on the EU. So we're happy to have Tala Henry here from US EPA, who is trying to put, again, the EU system in perspective and see how other regulatory systems work and what we can learn from those regulatory systems. Now, as I said, I'm mostly used to chairing regulatory meetings where the objective is consensus. I'm not doing that now. Here, my task is to be a moderator, so I want you to be clear and provocative, to be interesting to the audience. Now, the panel today will be, I think, first we will start with the question, are we making the right choices of risk management, and can we do better? Fleur van Broekhuizen will explain how this works and what considerations we need to take into account. Fleur is working at the Bureau REACH, or at the Rijksinstituut voor Volksgezondheid en Milieu, which is, for those who do not speak Dutch, and for the few who are not familiar with RIVM, because I think everybody knows RIVM, it's a sort of EPA. It's Environmental Protection Agency in the Netherlands. Fleur is coordinating the implementation of the SVHC roadmap, so SVHC's substances of very high concern, in the Netherlands, and she's chairing and participating in a lot of European coordination groups. Then we will ask France Capon to tell us about the industry perspective to risk management. And she will tell us that industry is looking for predictability and transparency, but very often is faced with a crystal ball. She will tell us what is, from her perspective, in the crystal ball, and how we can make risk management work better to a brighter future of regulatory risk management. France is the manager at the EU Precious Metal Federation, and she's very active and a key pillar of Eurometaux. Then Frida will push us to climb the mountain of substitution. And she will tell us about how we can better use the power of the front runners. Frida is a coordinator for strategic policy work at Chemsec, also an NGO that I think I don't have to introduce. I think you're very well known to the audience. And then Matti will try to answer a very interesting question. Why does nobody like authorization? Nevertheless, he will tell us what it has achieved. So I think there's also a lot of things that I think we should appreciate, having learned from the experience in authorization, and he will do that. Matti is the head of one of the risk management units at ECHA, specifically dealing with authorization. And then finally, as announced, we will look beyond the EU, and Tala Henry will tell us how the EU, sorry, I'm so much used to the EU, how the US is dealing with risk management and what we can learn from the US experience. Tala is a Deputy Director of the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics at the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. So that's all for the introduction, and I'm very happy to ask Fleur to start with telling us about whether we are making the right choices in risk management and how we can actually do better. Fleur.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. When I was invited to this meeting and was invited to talk for 10 minutes about this subject and how to choose the best RMOA, I thought I should give you 3 key messages that I think are vital in our decision-making process. And to illustrate this by one example that I will show you at the end of this 10 minutes. I have these key messages on the first page of my presentation, and I will also end with these. And the first message that I wanted to give to you is the best regulatory option is a policy decision. And that means that it's no science, it's no mathematics, and therefore it's less predictable than every one of us would like to have sometimes. My second message is, which may be a little bit more encouraging, is that everybody can make a difference by supplying the information they think that regulators need to make the most appropriate decision. And that holds for NGOs, and it holds for industry, and it holds for all stakeholders in our society. While doing so, I come to my third message, which is that maximum understanding of a concern for a chemical doesn't necessarily lead to the most optimum risk management measure. And that I will come to at the end as well, because generating information takes time, and some concerns don't have the time to wait for this information. So it's very important that the information comes timely. So with this, I would like to point out that the most appropriate RMO, risk management option, is to some extent subjective. It's very much dependent on the eyes of the beholder, on the perspective of the policymaker, of the NGO, of the industry that has an advantage of keeping the substance in the market and having it as little regulated as possible, because safe use can already be maybe facilitated via other means also. While deciding about the most appropriate RMOA, we have key principles that we keep, that we sort of check in our decision-making process. And, well, 3 most important ones are that the regulatory measure should be effective. It should address the concern that we have. It should be targeted, and it should be timely. One of the key principles that's often not spoken out so clearly, but that is highly influencing the decision-making process, is all the uncertainties that are not further filled with information. And these uncertainties lead policymakers to work with assumptions, and these assumptions are often filled in by worst-case approximations of what we think as regulators is close to realistic practice. So these uncertainties, together with the information that we have on a substance and the concerns that we have, can lead to different regulatory options, different ways of addressing a concern, which can be at the European level, when we need overarching European rules to guarantee safe use. It can also be on a national level. And depending on the type of concern, being concern in specific products like toys or biocides, it can be dealt with a specific product legislation, or it needs to be more source-oriented and dealt with under REACH. So this is how we try to weigh concerns against the efficiency of a regulation, the purpose of a regulation. And I will illustrate this now against the case that we had in the Netherlands, that we brought forward in the Netherlands already some years ago on a substance which is an A-product solvent. And at that moment in time, had only indicative OELs to organize the safety at the workplace. It's a substance that is not found in consumer articles. It's not the concern for the environment, so the concern only related to workers. And what we found was that because there was only an indicative occupational safety limit and no binding limits, there were several companies within Europe at several different member states where different safety levels were implemented at the work floor, and as a consequence, risks for workers appeared at several places, whereas safe use could be possible. At that moment in time, even though the occupational safety and health legislation facilitates in deriving binding occupational safety and health limits, at that moment the prospect was that it would take long times before such a binding OEL was actually in place. And because of this high volume substance and the risks we saw for workers, it was concluded to put this substance on the candidate list to have a very quick signaling of the concern that we had for the substance, pushing towards substitution, pushing to, once it was on the authorization list, to applications for authorization via which safe use conditions would be prescribed. Around this same time, when this process was ongoing, information from industry came to the Netherlands that actually, in fact, safe use could be possible and was already implemented at several workplaces. That substitution for less hazardous chemicals had already been taking place for all those uses for which substitution was really feasible at that moment in time. And they advocated that it could well be possible to write down clear safety practices that could then be implemented for all the users within Europe. From that, the Netherlands concluded that it was or could be highly beneficial to have one restriction to cover all concerns instead of an authorization from which we expected that many applications for authorization would result, that we then had to deal with as authorities but also as industries, which would lead to possibly a less advantageous system than having one restriction in which you would set a binding safety level, which we then in the registration defined as a binding DNL, both for inhalation and for dermal contact, which would then add onto the tools that were already implemented under the occupational safety and health, and that would save the need for the many applications for authorization. So what I try to illustrate with this case is that actually for this problem in which we had risks for workers and no consumer problem, no environmental problem, but purely the risk for workers could be addressed by 3 different types of regulatory action. It was already addressed by the Occupational Safety and Health Directive. It could have been further addressed by this directive if there had been the prospect of a quick derivation of a binding OEL. It was well regulated under the authorization route, but maybe a little bit too well, because authorization would address all users. And the restriction gave us the possibility to develop a very targeted approach that only addressed the workers and only addressed the setting of a safe threshold at the workplace with safe measures. So with this, I come to my final slide and I return to my 3 key messages and hope to have shown you that there is not just one way to Rome, and that the information that was supplied by industry did help. It did not come as timely as possible to directly go to restriction from the concern we had for workers, but led first to authorization, but it came relatively soon enough. But also emphasize that in that case, then the authorization was brought forward to address all the concerns that we had, which may have been a little bit too much. So with this, I would like to close my 10 minutes and return to the sofa.
Thank you very much, Fleur. Thank you very much also for well respecting the time. It's just 3 seconds before the end. And while there's a change of speakers, I'd just like to highlight that indeed, I think what Fleur told us is also based a little bit on the experience then when we had so many regulatory risk management tools. The choice sometimes was a bit chaotic. And this is where RMOA, Risk Management Options Analysis, came in. It's still a very informal tool, but I think it is a very essential tool to optimize what we're doing. But now France will actually prove that Fleur is right, that perspective matters, and she will present us the industry perspective. France, please.
Thank you, Otto. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to the organizers. It's really nice to be here and to share our views as industry. And before starting with the presentation, and it's a pity that Mr. Calleja left already, but I want to say that chemicals industry it's once, but we have also the metals industry. Metals are chemicals, we know that, but there are some specificities. And if the aim of the Commission is to have the chemicals industry being part of the solution of tomorrow for the future, I must tell you that for the circular economy, metals is already the future, is already now the solution, and that circular economy is in our genes. And it's why in some of the recommendations that I will share with you today, it's so important to have a complete integration of some of the EU policies. This being said, we look backwards with our colleagues from the metal sectors, and we look at the learnings on the risk management selections. It's now a few years that we are doing that. It's still a quite new process if you compare with the risk assessment, which started in the 60s, but it's already good learnings that we can take from the current experience. And indeed, as mentioned in the introduction, what we are concerned by, it's really the lack of predictability and transparency of the risk management analysis process. Sometimes it's very transparent, member states contact you, you can discuss with them. Sometimes it's just a black box, and we want to have a little bit more predictability for our internal work. Another learning that we had, it's, okay, let's look at the past, what was done with some of our metals, like the chromates, for example, was always the correct risk management option chosen? That's a question. Authorization, Matti will tell you that we don't like it so much. That's not true. Sometimes we think that this is the right option. This could be the right option when we know that substitution is really there and it's close to us and to push to give the kick. And you can see that, for example, with the authorization of Chromium 6 in tin can manufacturing, this really helped to reduce and to achieve really a sustainable substitution, which is important. But when you look at Chrom 6 at the workplace, what was really the added value? Did it work? It was cumbersome. We have not seen a change in the substitution. What's really the added value there? I wouldn't be too provocative neither, but is it a cash machine? What does it help? Therefore, that's a question that we ask ourselves, and we need to see how to really take the learnings from there. Other considerations, we heard also this morning from Jørn Hansen that it's very important to have good information available, and of course the compliance, completeness of the registration dossier is really key. But for a good RMOA, you don't need just what you have in your existing registration. You need insights on alternatives. You cannot find that in the registration dossier. You need insights on socioeconomic aspects. You don't have that in your registration dossier. Therefore, it's really important to find a way, because industry has really at hand this information, to share that better with authorities. And lastly, we must acknowledge also that as industry, we were very, very focused the past years on generating data. We are still in the course of doing that with some testing proposal, having risk assessment done and so on, but anticipate the risk management measures will be more and more key. What do you think it's important in an RMOA? Confirm the relevancy of the concerns or the risk to handle. That's critical. It's important also to define the potential interactions. We heard that this morning, the barriers must be really demolished, abolished now between some EU policies, and especially with the circular economy, but also with the climate target. Take, for example, some decisions under the chemicals management on cobalt. You can hamper really some of the targets for the electrical mobility. Therefore, it's really important to have a comprehensive overview. Screen and identify the most efficient options and really open your mind to REACH tools, OSH tools, environmental tools. We need to be really broad in the thinking. And of course, screening the cost effectiveness. That's really important. Do you take a big hammer to kill a small mosquitoes? No, I think it has to be really proportionate. What do we recommend as improvements? What are our solutions that we would like to promote? And it's solutions for everybody, for us too as industry. It's to provide a solid starting point. We need a good prioritization system. We need strong registration dossier, being able perhaps to add or to include in our registration dossier more information than just the legal requirements about alternatives or other fields. Have more consistency and better quality. If you have a similar situations, like a workplace concerns, why do you choose different risk management options? You have, for example, with the lead compounds, a workplace issue. It has been decided recently to go for the update of the OEL. But for the cobalt, it's now a restrictions under a completely different way of calculating a value. Why being inconsistent when the concerns at the beginning is very, very similar? Therefore, we think that this has to be better aligned. We need also to share the burden between authorities and industry. We have the knowledge. We can really be very useful in the thinking process. And again, promoting the integration of the EU objectives, this is critical. And I will show you that with the example of the lead and lead oxide, which is closer to my heart because these substances are critical for the refining and the recycling of our precious metals. Let's take the example of providing the solid starting point. What we did as precious metals industry with our colleagues from the lead consortium, we have provided more data to have a more robust registration dossier, monitoring data, all the information needed to do that. We worked also as an industry, as precious metals industry, into a kind of mirror RMOA. What do we think we need to better address the risk management in-house? We need also, and we looked at the learnings from the PBO, from the lead oxide, the lead compounds, which are now, as I told you, into the OEL process, because lead is coming into the pipeline. How can we be consistent again with that? This brings me to the second point. Indeed, why going for an authorization, a prioritization system for lead, while we know, right now, when we know that OEL is under review? Is it the right approach? Is it not super killing the things, while mainly the workplace issue is at stake? How to share better the burden between industry? As I said, all available information must be shared in one way or another, or via registration dossier, or via hearings, or via public consultation. There is no preferred route, but share the knowledge. It is also important for us as industry to take our responsibilities, and we have the possibility, for example, in our registration dossier, to use the tool of the use advised against, to give also some risk management measures proposal. Lastly, how to promote better the integration of the EU objectives. This is a very nice scheme that I like. The smooth mobility is also about the bike. The smooth recycling and circular economy, it's also about chemicals management and the fact that we have to keep some of the SVHC in the loop. I heard again this morning that the aim of DG Environment is to have a circular economy without SVHC. Forget about it. Look at this wheel. You take out some SVHC like the lead or lead oxide, your bike is not running anymore. There is no circularity anymore, and I cannot recycle my precious metals anymore. Therefore, it's really, really important to think broader, to not just look at chemicals management, circular economy, climate target. It's very important to have a comprehensive overview and to take that into account in the risk management option analysis. That's my key messages for today, and I hope that we will have exciting discussion about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, France. Thank you for taking my request to be clear very seriously, and thank you also for respecting the time. I think your message was think carefully before you decide. And just one word also on bringing on the table issues like chromates and lead. I think it is very important for the clarity of discussion that we go to examples, and this is why I didn't want you to shy away from making statements like it was the wrong risk management option. But I would also like to go a little bit deeper later on and ask why exactly. So we're coming back to that question. But now Frida is going to change the perspective yet again to the NGO perspective, and she is, as I said in the introduction, trying to bring us to the summit of substitution. So I think substitution is probably more at the center of your presentation. Frida, please.
Thanks a lot, and thank you, Otto, for the introduction, and thanks for the organizers to invite me to speak here at this panel. Also thanks, Otto, to asking the environmental NGO to be provocative. So I will do my very best. So, let's see. Yes, best regulatory risk management. There are, of course, a number of options on how to most efficiently regulate substance of concern. Today, I will mostly focus on authorization, the option Chemsec has been mostly involved in during the last years. Authorization, Annex 14, can be seen as a far-reaching regulatory option, since its idea is to ban all uses for all European companies of a specific substance, unless that company and use has received a so-called authorization. Well, since we are talking about the most hazardous substances, the substance identified as substance of very high concern, we think this far-reaching regulatory option is a very reasonable approach. REACH aims to protect human health and the environment and aims to phase out the most concerning substances. And authorization is one of the very important pillars. And as you know, the authorization process starts with the process to define the most concerning substances, the substance of very high concern, and add these to the candidate list. And to define substances on their intrinsic properties presents opportunities. It makes things clearer for people outside of the chemical world. It helps companies and brands to prioritize these substances for substitution, a clear benefit of REACH. It drives innovation, and it provides information to formulators on what substances to develop alternatives to. This identification of the high concern substances that the candidate list provides clearly drives innovation and substitution. It gives companies heads up and opportunities to, in their own pace, work out a plan for substitution. There is no panic involved, and that helps when you need to be creative and innovative. Once the same substance is added to Annex 14, there is a whole other story. It's a time pressure involved, and it's easier to panic than being creative. Chemsec created the SIN list more than 10 years ago, aiming to push both regulators and companies to move further in their activities for substitution, and certainly it has. Today it's used by regulator, by companies all over the world, in public procurement, by NGOs, by investors. And building on the candidate list is the authorization procedure. And this procedure adds to the hazard identification and looks at the risk elements as well. And REACH says that authorization should just be given if the risks are controlled, there are no alternatives, and the benefits outweigh the risks of continued use. It's a great setup. It's a beautiful piece of work. But the devil is, as always, in the implementation. And in our view, the authorization system, unfortunately, today doesn't work the way it's intended to. European Commission have transformed the REACH authorization into a mere toll, assuming any company asking for an authorization has the right to one. We have spent years in criticizing ECHA, Commission, Member State for granting authorizations when we have clearly seen that alternatives are available. We have talked to a number of very upset companies, startup, progressive companies, or just normal companies, who put a lot of resources and money into complying with REACH and phase out the specific SVHCs, and then found out that their competitor just applied for an authorization and could continue to use that SVHC in question. And this practice has also made the authorization process unclear for industry and not made use of their innovation potential. And in our view, this is very unfortunate, and it gives an authorization system a bad reputation. And our main concern has been that authorizations has been given regardless of alternatives being available. Not in all cases, but in some. And for us, that is just as bad. It disfavors the frontrunners and the innovators. Something that feels like a really bad way of dealing with things. We'll soon hear Matti talk about the benefits of authorization regardless of some very bad decision. He might not put it in that way, though. We are glad that there are benefits regardless of these bad decisions, and that authorization still supports innovation. But we, like EU, to do better. To focus on the ones finding solutions, on removing the hazardous chemical, not focusing on conservative Italian dyers of wool unwilling to substitute on the European market. It's not worth it. Well, you can probably hear I'm a bit upset about this issue. And we have been really furious over the years on the system, to the extent we actually even sued the Commission in one specific case. And so did the Kingdom of Sweden, and in their ruling came in the beginning of March this year. The judgment in the lead chromate case between Sweden and the Commission from March is very clear in its analysis. The judgment sets a new precedent for how REACH authorization should be handled in the future. Commission, ECHA, SEAC, and member state needs to change the way they work with applications for authorization. The judgment very clearly point out the burden of proof of alternatives is not, that alternatives are not available is on the company applying for authorization. It's not on the committees in ECHA, not on the Commission, not on member state, not on the alternative providers. It's on the applicant. Moreover, the Commission does not have the right to grant authorization if there are still uncertainties at the time of the decision. And the Commission cannot put in place conditions for the applicant to make up for uncertainties in the application. The judgment is very clear on this. The Commission has now appealed this case this week, actually. It's not official, so we don't know exactly the parts they are appealing on. But regardless of the appeal, I hope that the Commission, as well as ECHA and SEAC, use this ruling as a turning point, as an opportunity to improve the system, make sure REACH drives substitution of hazardous chemicals and innovation even further, and also achieve better its aim to protect human health and the environment. Oh, sorry. Making the authorization work in a more efficient way is also beneficial for industry. Now, we are somewhere in a limbo. I mean, European industry is very competent to deal with very complex tasks. But they need predictability and a clear message from the decision makers. If they have that, they know their prerequisites and can act from that. Chemsec is in contact with a number of progressive companies, and that group is a growing number. Many companies have understood the benefits of being proactive and work towards sustainability. We see more and more companies setting ambitious targets, also publicly. And for us, that's a clear trend. Companies daring to say they are not perfect, that they have issues they need to tackle. I think setting official ambitious targets is a very good way. It helps shaping the culture within that company to be a proactive and engaged company, being attractive both for employers and consumers, as well as for the future. We also see more and more companies working to adopt their business into a circular economy with all the opportunities and challenges that brings. We also see an increased interest from investors in this field. They like to know how they can be sure to invest in the future-proof companies, the progressive ones, the ones with a plan and strategy to move away from hazardous chemicals. In the past 2 years, Chemsec's list has been part of the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And for us, this is just the beginning of the impact investors might have in this area. Also looking at Chemsec's newest tool, Marketplace, a dating site for buyers and providers of alternatives to substances of very high concern, we see a huge increase in companies advertising they have alternatives to substances of very high concern and the ones looking for alternatives. And this is not just a European issue. The tool has users and ads from all over the world. So how do you do that? How to achieve a substitution where feasible? I put down 3 C words here: clarity, collaboration, and cooperation. Meaning industry needs clarity on what the regulatory boundaries are. Moreover, there is a need for collaboration and cooperation within the companies, between innovators and regulators, between science and developers. Substitution is in most cases not easy. As a company, you benefit from starting substitution work already when a chemical is added to the candidate list, or even before, on the sin list. We all, not just NGOs, but Commission, ECHA, Member States, CEFIC, Eurometaux, need to start to talk more about substitution, and we all need to look at the possibilities and to support the front runners. That will make us ready for the future.
Thank you very much, Frida. I think we started with one consensus element is do substitution where it is feasible. I think so far we agree, but we've heard France who has said, look, we're aware we're dealing with hazardous metals and chemicals. but we can do the job, and we're part of the solution. Whereas Frida is telling us, look, we are not dealing with just any chemicals, we are dealing with very hazardous chemicals, and we should be more courageous and more inventive to go further than what we were, and trying to see substitution as an opportunity. But as he said, the devil is very much in the detail. So now we have Matti, who is the master of details here at ECHA, and he will tell us how he's taming the devil. Matti, please.
Trade-off. That's, I think, the way I would summarize my presentation. My dear colleague from the Commission, Otto, asked me to answer a couple of questions, and I'll try to answer them as well as I can. The first that he asked was, how effective is authorization to improve handling of the SVHCs? Well, it's a kind of a parable. The REACH review actually looked into this already and was published last year, and one of the findings some of the findings are on the slide. First, it concluded, there was a big study made to help the Commission there, and the study concluded that companies reduced, about 1/3 of the companies interviewed reduced exposure or improved chemicals risk management as a result of the authorization requirement. And also they concluded that SVHCs have become significantly safer for those, obviously, which were subject to authorization. It also looked into the costs, because the reduction, of course, comes with a cost. And the system costs at the European level are 25 million euros for about 50 applications per year. That was sort of the benchmark. And surprisingly, I think to some, 1/3 of the was only what I would call the system cost for the application. 1/3 was for the risk reduction of the costs, and then one was for the decision making, which is the RAC and the SEAC and the Commission and so on, which are actually doing the decision making. So there's a trade-off between how much risks are reduced, how much things are costing. The next question, that's really for Frida. How effective is authorization system as it is seen by the companies in inducing substitution? Now, this was asked from companies who have either applied or not applied. We in ECHA or in the Commission mainly see companies who apply, and therefore it's important to know the ones who did not apply. And about, of the interviewed companies, of course, about half surveyed had substituted, in other words, had not applied. In other words, the signaling of the candidate list or other similar lists does work. Companies actually take those seriously and do substitution, and therefore either don't apply or have no even intent to apply. And there's a conclusion that REACH authorization seems to be the major, but not the only, driver for substitution. This is from the impact, the impact of authorization study that the Commission made. The slide over there says the REACH authorization process is the most important driver for substitution, and access to the suitability and possibility of alternatives as part of the applications for authorization process is the second most important driver. To make things concrete, I have two examples. One of them is a bit an old one, but I think is a significant one. That's concerning Murano Glass. Those who've been to Venice know this, beautiful glass that is made, except that it was using arsenic trioxide as a controlling agent for the bubbles. The Italian government realized that this is going to be a problem for many small as medium-sized companies to either apply for the authorization or to substitute. So they actually set up a research program. I believe it was about 300,000 euros that they put in to help out in finding solutions, and they did. So they've got something called cerium oxide and then ground granulated blast furnace slag to replace the arsenic trioxide successfully. The most interesting part here was that it was not only helping the workers, but also when you looked at the arsenic concentrations in the whole Murano Island, there was measured data about this, and just two highlights. Before this transition took place, the emissions were or the concentrations were more than 200 nanograms per cubic meter. After there were 4, a 98% reduction in ambient air concentrations, a major improvement for air quality. The European level, by the way, is 6 nanograms, and same goes also for Italy. So substitution helped there, and I don't think it would have happened without the authorization. I'm pretty confident of that. Another one, which is actually yesterday, Chemsec is being used as one application is to coat cylinders for printing and packaging. DG Research gave under Horizon 2020 €3 million to a consortium of groups trying to find cheaper ways of doing that, a replacement with something called diamond-like carbon. They believe themselves that they've succeeded. They had yesterday a sort of bigger launch about that in Germany, and they think that they have now a fairly cheap alternative, which is definitely technically feasible. That's not the issue. The question is whether it's economically feasible. In other words, can companies do actually better with the new technology? They believe they actually can. Again, I think this is a good example of two types of policies working together, the authorization pressure at the same time with substitution from DG Research, in this case Horizon 2020, to get further improvements. Oh, what happened now? I pressed the wrong button. Sorry, can I get back? Yeah, okay, good. Okay, now, one question that Otto asked is, what have we achieved with authorization that could not have been done with restrictions? I think that's, first of all, it's a good question, but I think you can also ask the question the other way around. Remember that I will not answer that question, but I think it's good to think about the other way around. Now, from member states' point of view, what is appealing in authorization is actually quite quick. Member states can and have identified substances of very high concern. We have 197 of them in the candidate list at the moment, and that in itself leads also to action to substitute. Mind you, we have only 43 substances in the authorization list, and only for 27 we have received applications. In other words, substitution has been also taken place there. The second one, which I think is very appealing, is that authorization system is information revealing of the uses and the alternatives through the application process. Authorities have always difficulties finding the uses, in particular the alternatives, when they do restriction, for instance. The third one is who pays for what. I just took two examples, and this is not comparing actually apples and sausages, so these are not comparable numbers, but illustrate the point. We have about 20 restrictions that have been going through the decision-making system in the Commission in the past 10 years. On the average, they cost, together they cost about €290 million to implement, okay, per year. Now, the system cost for the applications, as I said earlier, for 43 substances are 25 million a year. So it's actually quite a cheap system to implement. But because companies, if they substitute, we're assuming the cost is of course zero, which it isn't, but if they substitute, they don't apply, and this is the application system costs, okay? The final one, which is a bit sort of maybe an important thing to think about, is the system, the state aid compatibility. If you have a subject to authorization, you definitely can get state aid, in other words, research funding. For restrictions, you might not be able to get that because of state aid considerations. Does authorization work? I think this, if you think about the objectives of authorization, the good function of the market, yes, it works. We still need improvements in the application system, predictability and system efficiency. We might have unknown or hidden costs, and we need to work on that. The risks, are they properly controlled? The risk reduction has been well demonstrated, and of course risks should be reduced further, but at least there's a mechanism of doing that. Have substances progressively been replaced by suitable alternatives? Definitely. But it could be done even more, and that's where the discussion is very often, for instance, with the NGOs and alternative providers. Now, why does authorization have few friends? at least I've noticed in my work in ECHA that industry is not really in favor of that. NGOs are not in favor of that. The alternative providers are not in favor of that. There are very few actually in favor, except the ones who put things to Annex 14 to the candidate list, or to the candidate list and wait that something happens, meaning ECHA and the Commission do something. Now, maybe the reason is that it was over-ambitious in terms of expectations. What is it in particular the so-called upstream applicants know about the use and the alternatives? This is very much at the heart of the debate as far as I can see. What information is actually effortlessly passed up and down the supply chain? It's not only an authorization question, but in general a question. The legal text is not always unambiguous, and I was not provocative here. What are technical and economically feasible alternatives in general to the applicant? What are the benefits for the applicants or the society, or the risks to the applicant or the society? And here's where the trade-off comes in. The beauty of authorization, it is transparent. All the numbers are there. People can make they get the information. Whether they then make the conclusion the same way seems to be very different. Then something is quite easy to say no to an authorization or not to authorize. The thing is that applications are made for a reason. The applicant does believe that he doesn't actually have an alternative and gives the information. The information system is quite asymmetric. You get information, but you don't have independent verification of that. Even you try to do that during the public consultation by SEAC and so on. I give you one example. What is the same compared to similar as a function? Where do you actually draw the line? And it's actually quite complicated. One thing is the authorization system is still very new. We are the only ones in the world who are doing something like this. And it's in particular in its operations quite new. The Commission hasn't made very many decisions. Half of the opinions that have been sent have not been decided by the Commission. And the key question is, what's the right level of scrutiny? At least when I've looked at the applications for authorization, the scrutiny that we're putting there by SEAC and RAC and the Commission is very, very thorough. And that seems not to be enough. We need to do more. And what is the more? That means what would we be doing? So, trade-off in terms of resource use, trade-off in terms of benefits, and trade-off in terms of risk reduction would be my plea. Let's make this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matti. I see you changed the slides slightly compared to the last version that I had seen. The last version that I had seen said, why does authorization has no friends? Now it says, why does authorization have few friends? But yeah, but I'm very, very happy that you ask us to take a step back and see, well, after all, what have we achieved with authorization, and isn't it good after all? So maybe after the discussion there are a few more friends of authorization. Let's see what the discussion gives. But now we go to a country who doesn't have authorization, and we wonder how you can do without authorization. How are you doing risk management, and what do you think works in your system, and what are the things that we in Europe could potentially learn from the US? Tala, please.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to participate here today. Just as way of a little bit of background, what I'll be speaking about specifically today is risk management under the Toxic Substances Control Act. And just to remind all, this does not include chemicals such as pesticides or cosmetics in the US. This is really sort of the industrial chemical universe. And there are very specific exclusions, including pesticides and cosmetics that are covered under different legislations. As a first off, within the TSCA realm here, the law speaks very distinctively to two different chemical programs, a new chemicals program and existing chemicals. So I'll just give a little bit of background on the risk management options, I guess is the word we're using today, under each of those programs. So for our new chemicals program, so a new chemical just simply means a chemical that is not currently on our TSCA inventory, which is the list of all chemicals that are potentially in commerce today in the United States. And then as soon as a new chemical does in fact commence and become commercialized, it becomes an existing chemical. So while I'll describe how we do the prospective risk management for a new chemical, once it does in fact commercialize, all the options that I'll talk about in the existing chemicals realm can be invoked at any time. So as I'm mentioning, in our new chemicals program, this is a prospective assessment. Unlike the EU, we don't have a requirement for a lot of data up front, so we rely heavily on computational tools and other new approach methodologies here. What I have arrayed on this slide are the 5 different findings one might make in this prospective assessment. The first being that the chemical under its conditions of use does in fact present an unreasonable risk. This finding is rather rare simply because we don't often have a full array of data on that particular chemical. When we have come to this finding, it's because the chemical has a very, very close analog, or the component of the chemical is very clearly another chemical for which we have very strong data. And if we have this finding, then we would move into restrictions or prohibitions. And that might be, it's usually not the whole chemical itself, but particular uses or the way in which it's made or so forth. Then we have another finding, may present unreasonable risk. The bar is not quite as high there, especially useful for the situation where we don't have a lot of data on the particular chemical. We can, if evidence points that it could present or may present, we can invoke that finding. And there, typically we still would allow commercialization, but with whatever restrictions are necessary to mitigate any risks found. There is another finding, it's just that the chemical is being slated to be produced in substantial quantities, so we call this our exposure-based finding. So again, there it's just that if the exposure seems to be so large that we have concerns, we might make this finding. And again here, commercialization may still be allowed, but sometimes there's testing that has to be conducted at some point of production usually. Then we have a new finding under our amended TSCA legislation from 2016, and that is insufficient information to make a reasoned evaluation. In this case, we just perhaps don't have adequate data on analogs or from predictive models, and so we essentially prohibit the commercialization until such data that allows us to make a reasoned evaluation is developed. And then finally, there's the not likely to present an unreasonable risk. Before the amendments to TSCA in 2016, if we didn't make a previous finding and we didn't have all of these choices, the chemical was just allowed to go. In this case, we have to now make a definitive finding, any one of these, but in particular, if it's not likely, we have to be explicit about it and we have to publish a statement, and then commercialization can go forward from there. So that's sort of the prospective side of the house. Now I'll move into our existing chemicals. And again, as I mentioned, once a new chemical goes into commercialization, it becomes an existing chemical. So anything here is available. And I didn't know these slides had these extra things. So the risk evaluation is a precursor to any risk management under the new law. So we shall, in US legal parlance, shall means must, essentially. So we must conduct a risk evaluation to determine whether the chemical presents an unreasonable risk, and we may not, in that endeavor, during the evaluation, consider costs or other non-risk factors. So again, this is a prerequisite to taking any risk management. But if we do, in fact, find unreasonable risk, we must take risk management action. And the amendments to the law, again, shall propose. So we can't, if we find risk, we are compelled or mandated to move forward with risk management. And we need to do so do a proposal within 1 year, and then publish a final rule which puts in place the risk management within 2 years. And if anyone knows anything about rulemaking in the United States, those are very ambitious schedules. And of course, at least there's one possible extension under certain circumstances. Just to kind of lay the field here, we can regulate manufacturers and processors, distributors, commercial uses, and entities that dispose of chemicals. We can't directly regulate consumers. We can advise, we can make recommendations on how people can use products properly or mitigate exposures, but we can't reach down and prohibit a person from using a product. Okay, I'm going to click through these. I didn't know these were all here. So the point here is that we have a lot of options, the risk management options. As Fleur was sort of overviewing, I think that there's a lot of similarity here. These are the key principles, if you will. This is what the TSCA law authorizes us to do. And you can see that it ranges from prohibition or banning or otherwise limiting or restrictions on the manufacture, the processing, or the distribution. Maybe not as extreme. We can also prohibit or limit a specific or particular use and or a concentration of the chemical in whatever particular use or product. The third one there is clear and adequate warnings and instructions. Essentially, this is labeling. We can require certain record keeping, monitoring, whether that be workplace monitoring or environmental monitoring or testing. We can prohibit or regulate the manner or method of commercial use, so sort of design the risk mitigation options into the particular use of a chemical. And of course, we can prohibit or otherwise regulate the methods of disposal. So perhaps an example would be this type of chemical or product with the chemical needs to be incinerated versus going to a landfill, et cetera. And then the final is sort of a catch-all, which if read in total is sort of the authority to do sort of like a recall. So tell people that, give warnings, public notice, and then provide for replacement or repurchase of the recalled item. So again, there's a lot of options there, which essentially provides, for the tailoring of the risk management options to the chemical, to the use, and really what we're after here is mitigating whichever exposures are potentially causing the risks. I don't know who made these slides. There's a couple other things, however, when we go into the risk management options here, is we have to take into considerations, and this seems to me, I'm not a real expert on your risk management options analysis, but it seems like there are definitely analogies here. So we need to consider, not only the effects to health and the environment, but also the benefits of the chemical substance for its various uses. And we do, in fact, with any kind of regulation, need to do an economic analysis, as well as considering alternatives. So we need to consider whether or not there's a technically and economically feasible alternative. And to the last speaker's comment, those are words in a law. subject to a lot of interpretation depending on whatever data is possible. Just because we are talking about your labeled SBHCs, we don't have that label in the US per se, but we are, as part of our new law, required by this June to put out a regulation that addresses persistent bioaccumulative and toxic chemicals. It's kind of a one-off provision in the law where we need to basically fast track without a risk evaluation to the risk management of a number of chemicals that were on our 2014 TSCA list of priorities. So with that, that's just one example of some of the risk management that we have ongoing right now that's sort of in the realm of that the subject, what is it, SBHCs. So we don't use that term, but similar type of approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tala. Well, I think if we're comparing US and Europe, well, one thing is a clear advantage of the US system. You're probably much less administrative and more focused on things. But what I've heard also is you've been talking a lot about data that you would like to have, but may not necessarily have. So I think that's, to me, I think the most striking thing if comparing the two systems. But you also talked about commonalities. You were talking about the need for tailoring risk management measures. I've heard terms that are quite familiar to us, like economic and technical feasibility. We're also using that in authorization. So I think we're faced with exactly the same choices, and we're having a lot of analogies, and I think there's a lot of perspective to learn from each other. So thank you very much for those interesting presentations, and we're now having a round of moderated discussion. So those are on questions that we actually shared. If I understood correctly, there is also the possibility to post questions in parallel, which I will then see on the screen. So I might actually interrupt the agreed scenario and take up one or the other question from the audience. But what I'd like to do is to go a little bit more in depth of the issues that you have already been addressing. So Fleur, you talked a lot about the considerations to be taken into account in risk management options analysis. Can I ask you how we could make that rather informal tool more effective? Should RMEO get a formal status? Should there be a process where you decide, okay, this is the risk management measure we take and we discard all the others? Or are we going to continue on this more or less informal step where we're doing that sometimes, but then we're still doing things in parallel? What do you think is the future of RMOA?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's very important to realize that the legal formal processes are already within reach. But you're also, of course, hinting at the interplay between the different regulations. And the RMOA is really set up as a documented place to facilitate discussions. And I think it's very good to keep it that way. And I think in my first key message that I presented just some minutes ago, it's very clear that whatever we decide is the best is very much what is considered to be the best at this moment in time, and is very much colored by the political climate, by the actors. So I think I would not advocate that we should make it formal simply because it's not the right place to make it formal.
So we should still look at all options, taking into account the lessons that we had from an RMOA?
Well, the RMOA is conducted by the member state at a member state level. There is no authority there to conclude about the best regulatory measure at a European level for that substance for all the regulatory frameworks that are there. It's simply not within the mandate.
Well, the criticism that I see sometimes when we're going for a risk management option, and maybe we go back to the Chromium 6 example, then at the later stages, that sometimes, well, you have a machinery which is just going ahead, and then it's sometimes a bit too late to take decisions, and then we're also having somehow, we're having different tools in place like REACH and especially the occupational safety and health legislation, which very often are, let's say, two alternatives to be considered. And then we get the reproach, okay, now we have authorization for Chromium 6, but wouldn't occupational and safety and health legislation have been the better tool? We heard also from France that now we're working on an occupational limit for lead compounds. Why should we do something on REACH? How does that work? How should we get, let's say, a more consistent, a more clear line? Is there a contradiction? Should there be cooperation? And maybe I keep that question for all members of the panel. Fleur, if you want to start, but then I'll also open it for the other members of the panel.
Yeah, I think with this question it's very important to, it's in a way it's all about information and having the correct or the right information to make informed decisions. I think what is very important to realize in all these questions is that we're talking about very toxic substances with very high concerns for humans and the environment, for which we had European agreement that we would like to substitute wherever possible, and we built the authorization process for this, which for which some may say we were giving too many authorizations or we allowed too many authorizations. But on the other hand, it's a nice system that allows for continued use for those users that really are needed within society, for which there are no alternatives yet. So I think that's within all the difficulties that we see, I think this ambition that we will all, that we all agree to, should be kept in mind.
Thank you, Fleur. France, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, of course, we fully agree, and we have really thought about this process of substitution. We hear from all the parts that it's very important, and we want to promote from our side a more sustainable substitution. It means that you have to take a lot of things into account, not just if it's technically or socio-economic feasible, but how does it match again with the full picture of the other EU policies. Coming back to the Chromium, we acknowledge that there were two counter-examples at the end of the day, perhaps in my presentation, because for some uses it worked, and you gave the same example in your presentation, Matti. For other uses, when it's strictly limited to workplace, we don't think that it's working. We know the limitation in the sense that authorization is still at the beginning driven by a substance, and it's the substance which is entering the pipeline. But when you come really to the discussion of the uses, why applying really the authorization to all the uses at the same time? We have tool also in the regulation to exempt some of the uses and to go to the tool like the Article 58.2. Why not thinking more that process to be efficient, more use by use? But to do that, I agree with you, Fleur, we need to have good data at the beginning, but this data must be taken into account too. And we know, and it's going back to the predictability and transparency, that sometimes it's not a very silly example from MSC last week. Some of the consideration put in an update of the dossier were not taking into account for a lead stabilizer, because in the past there were other uses and we want to be a little bit precautionary and so on. Therefore, we need also to be clear on what do we want. The best data, but the most recent one, have to be taken into account, and perhaps a more specific use risk management options. I think it's really important to think differently.
Okay, well, I understand there's a lot of complexity in the decisions. Of course, we regulator would like to have clarity. Do you have some ideas about how we could be more clear in saying we should do authorization, we should do restriction, we should do something else?
I think, I mean, there are really complementary systems. So, I mean, we are talking about the substance of very high concern, so we like to phase them out. And then, in some cases, authorization is the most efficient tool, sometimes the workers' protection, but they could also, it needs to be used in parallel. And we see that ECHA also having the aim to, when you have an authorization, also look into the restriction part, since we have all the problematic substances in the imported article. So I think we shouldn't sort of formalize this to say it's either this or this or this. We need, as Björn stated this morning, to work more interface-like. The information needs to be there, but also to cooperate and make use of all the tools we have to get rid of these chemicals.
Tala, you've seen how we're struggling with the complexity of decisions. You were already mentioning earlier that you're also dealing with trade-off and tricky decisions. Do you have some examples about what's happening in the US where you're facing similar difficult struggles about what to do about a particular chemical?
That's a loaded question, right? Well, one thing that is complicating our current work is that we did have some pretty significant amendments to our law in 2016, and certainly we are at the same time trying to continue our work that we had once begun, especially on some high priority chemicals that we had previously assessed. We're still trying to interpret and lay the foundation of how to implement the law at the same time. One recent example is that we I believe it was March or April, basically restricted the sale of methylene chloride to consumers. That was only one part of a proposal that was made previous to the new law. So once the new law came into play, we had to, basically go through all of our proposals and sort of reinterpret some of the ways forward as far as the risk management. But we did go forward and at least do part of it within the context that we had. At the same time, that methylene chloride was also on our first 10 assessments because the new law, again, had a broader scope as far as considerations of uses. So we have two different things kind of interplaying there. But when it comes down to the risk management, eventually, I think it's very similar in that there's a lot of things to consider. There's the outright risk that comes from the risk assessment, but our law, as I outlined, does require during that risk management process that other things also need to be considered, including economics and alternatives. So it's a lot of information to roll up. Another thing, I'm not as familiar with how you do things here, but all of our rulemaking processes are very transparent, and it's mandated that we have public participation. So every time that we're going to do some sort of restriction, in your words, we need to propose it, we need to take public and stakeholder comment on it, consider all of that before we go final. So I wouldn't call it a complication, it's just the way that we do business, and it does take some time.
Thank you very much. I think that sounds very familiar to Matti, who ECHA is doing a lot of public consultations. Something that also struck me in your presentation is you underlined at a particular point the importance of deadlines and the fact that the new legislation is much more focused on deadlines. I think that's also one of the really great things that made ECHA work compared to the previous legislation which we had, where very often the processes took ages because they are complex. So I see also there convergence and analogy. Let me now turn to one of the subjects that I have already announced. Let's go a little bit deeper into the Chromium 6 issue. France, you said that Chromium 6, the authorization was not the correct risk management option. Can you be more specific why you think that and what we should have done instead?
Again, it was a little bit my first reaction also. For the Chromium, it's mainly workplace. It's workplace issue. And indeed, for one example, the substitution worked, but we don't have evidence so far that there were plenty of substitution at the level of the plating sector, for example. There was also a misconsideration of how the supply chain was organized, which cost a lot of efforts, a lot of useless effort, I would say, to the industry, instead of putting all the efforts to address these workplace issues that we don't hide. There is one. And we know that the OEL was quite outdated. There is work, which is, will be ongoing on that. But the authorization system, as it is, was a lot of burden administration instead of focusing on what is important, worker safety. And we think really that having thought more about this before, with a good risk management options analysis, we could have really saved that time, plus all the mess at industry level with these upstream, downstream applications, which were quite complicated and without a lot of added value, because it was in your slides, I think, Matti, that you pointed that it's very difficult for the upstream to fully understand what they are doing very downstreams, because you don't have, it's not an easy supply chain. You don't start from one point and go into the next. You have 2, 3, 4 intermediates sometimes, traders, formulators, and so on, and it doesn't help. While thinking about workplace legislation would have been perhaps more efficient, quicker. For the substitution, just to finish on that, because of course we know that each time that we say that, the counter-argument is to say, yes, but worker legislation doesn't push enough for substitution while authorization is doing. That's true, but don't forget that when you use such a type of substances, you have other drivers than the regulatory pressure to substitute. It's not, when I was working for the Nickel Institute in the past, we did a lot of visits of plating sites with nickel, and all of them, they said, if we could get rid of substances of concern, we would do, because it's a burden also for the industry, but it's a burden which is needed because it has specific properties that you cannot replace. Therefore, I think it's something, and you can put all the regulations in place. This will not, it's a complement of what exists already. I'm not sure that this will be the main trigger.
Thank you, Frans. I'm very happy that Frida already raised her hands. What do you think about it, Frida?
Well, I think that authorization in taking the Chromium 6 to Annex 14, I understand that that was very complicated for that industry. And I think in one way they panicked a bit. They were not being enough creative. It's not a secret. I mean, we know this for so long, that this is a really hazardous chemical. So having starting earlier to phase out and to use the alternatives would have been better, would have made the industry more ready for the authorization procedure, would have made industry writing better application for authorization, more specifying the use where the authorization is really needed. And I want to just reflect on what Matti said before. Authorization have very few friends. NGOs are very much a friend of authorization. But just as it's written in REACH, that if alternatives are available, authorization should not be given. That's a key point for us. And we know that there are a lot of alternatives for chromic plating. I've talked to so many of them, and they are also quite frustrated. But they also see the light in the end of the tunnel. They see that it's a possibility that their market will grow, that users of Chromium 6 will shift to alternatives. And I think that is really showing that even if it's a very painful process for this Chromium 6 industry, eventually the authorization drives substitution very efficiently.
Thank you, Frida. I think now the logical step is now to go to Matti. I think we worked together on economic analysis in DG Environment many years ago. So this is about the ex-post evaluation now of what happened on Chromium 6. Would ECHA again recommend to put Chromium 6 on Annex 14?
I think yes. The reasons are pretty simple. One is that industry did not do any action, as Frida was hoping, because of the OELs, and the restriction may or may not have come. When it came to Annex 14, there was a lot of action in industry. Second, I think we've learned, all of us, that how you organize the work in the supply chain is really important. And I think it's no secret that here industry failed pretty badly. The chrome sector in general was not so organized as many other sectors when it came to metals, and therefore it took a lot of time for industry actually to understand and figure out how to do the application process. Third, it was one of the first ones, big ones, that was coming in, and we now much better know how the system could have been applied, the whole system could have been applied better. But it just didn't work then. I think it would work now. So if this was now the choice, I think we would make a much better decision in that respect in terms of meeting the system. Now, restriction versus authorization. Remember we had DECA BDE, which was restricted, and HBCDD, which was subject to authorization. I think we could have just as well done the other way around. Both have been phased out. The mechanism was slightly different, but pretty much the same thing at the end of the day. The big difference is that in Chrome, the regulators did not know very much about how it was used. They knew the exposure part to some extent, and you remember the occupational limit at the time when this went to Annex 14 was 50 micrograms per cubic meter. Industry standard was something below that, and now, for instance, the applications that are coming in are promising to go to an equivalent of below 2. The occupational limit value today is 10. It's going to be 5. So industry is promising in applications to do much better than what the occupational limit values are. So I think the driver is really there for risk reduction and for substitution. I take what you're saying on plating, but at the same time we have alternative plating technologies which are there. And here the key question is, I think Frida pointed that out, is it the same quality or same function or similar quality and similar function? If I may, being in Finland, we don't produce cars that many. Is Mercedes the same car as a Lada? It's similar, but not the same. And the quality standards are actually different for different industries and so on. So the technology requirements are different. And that's why the trade-offs are so complicated. Looking at it from one perspective, you come to a different conclusion than to the other. Finally, I think what makes Chrome, I've never said this before, and this is actually I realized something now. Chrome, particularly interesting, is that there's no economic interest of the importers. We don't produce Chrome, we import Chrome. So importers of Chrome. Lanxess have no interest in this stuff. The value added of that in the production process is very small, or zero. So normally you would expect the supplier of the chemical to be very interested in the supply chain because they're selling a chemical for a profit. But here, it's not really that interest, which makes Chrome, I think, also very specific. It's the formulators who make the money, not the importers, or the users, of course, then. So, a couple of thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Matti. I'm not a very good multitasker, so I'm looking at the same time at the screen. There was a question which already went a little bit down. It was about OELs, and there was the question, well, are you really sure that OELs do the job? I think that was the core of that question. Frans, do you want to answer that one?
I can answer by another question. Are you really sure that authorization do the job? It's a question of enforcement. It's a question, it could be the same. Because sometimes when you see that for some of the substances on the prioritization list, you have no application, I'm not always sure that it's because it's substitute. Perhaps it's just because it's ignored, it's free riding, it's a lot of reasons why you don't get applications. Therefore, how can you prove it too? Of course, we are really, we acknowledge that the workplace is not perfect, that it was a slow process in the past, but we see also that there are some efforts of collaborations with ECHA and so on, also to use better database and so on. Therefore, I think this question about efficiency of the process can be posed also for authorization. It's just a question of good implementation, good enforcement.
Thank you very much, France. I'm seeing that we're coming close to the end of the question and answer session, but I see also Fleur's hand. Fleur, please.
I just wanted to shortly react on this question and your answer, whether or not IOELs can do the trick. And want just to remind everybody that within the Occupational Safety and Health Directive, actually substitution is the first requirement, especially for CMN substances. So asking the question whether or not IOELs do the trick shouldn't be the question.
With a view to the time, I would like to still ask one question that I expect a lot of reactions is, should we reject more authorization applications? And maybe I give Frida the first word on this question. Should we reject more authorization applications?
We should get better application for authorization. If we get relevant application for authorization, you don't need to reject anything. That's not the point for us. But if we're talking about the past ones, yes, we see actually quite a few application for authorization that should have been rejected or should be rejected because, Otto, you're still in, there are some applications still ongoing that you should take a decision on. And for some of those, you know what are those I'm talking about? Yes, a rejection is the only way.
I'm happy to look forward to a discussion in a coffee break then. Are there reactions from the others? Matti?
First one, on OELs, just to come back, I think there's an experience that when, at least I've witnessed very many times, when companies get together and apply for authorization, they start benchmarking. And they benchmark in risk management for the better ones. I've seen this time and time again, and this is something you would never get in under OEL because companies usually compete with each other and don't, exchanging information like this. So that's one thing that makes things different. Enforcement is not the way to get companies to work in terms of risk reduction. It's because it's in the interest of the companies themselves. Enforcement only helps. So we shouldn't count on enforcement to do the work. It's the industry has to do it themselves, and they usually do it very well. In particular, if it is a condition for an authorization. So I think there's a dynamic which is different, and we should not underestimate that. Granting or not granting authorizations, I think it really depends on the point of view. It's easy to talk about some particular niche applications where you might not want to need it because you should not. But then you can also look at it from the other point of view, is that, okay, what does actually happen to the quality of the products, the end products, if the authorization was not granted? And I gave you the example of cars, and there is a difference between different types of cars and the quality requirements, and therefore the plating requirements, and therefore the use of the chemical. And it's not easy, at least for me, to say which one is right and which one is wrong. Maybe it is easy for somebody else, but it's really the marketplace that very often makes those trade-offs and those choices. And to what extent should regulators get in that discussion is actually, to me, the key issue at the end of the day about that trade-off. Thank you.
Thank you, Matti. I think that also ties in with one of the questions that I see on the screen, where it's highlighted that the substances cannot always be substituted in a specific applications, as the alternatives do not always perform the same. So a lot of the choices that we see and that keep us busy up to the courts is actually the question, what do we do in case we have a slightly different performance? In the case of the lead chromates, we had the question, is a different, slightly different color, is that actually something that is acceptable, or is a different durability acceptable? And here is a terribly difficult question for ECHA and the Commission to answer. Should we take decisions on behalf of citizens and on behalf of the consumers that we shouldn't have, that we should or should not have a particular shade of a color? Frida, please.
Yes, you should take decisions, because what you're doing is to protect human health and environment, and that's your job. So, and I understand there's a more complex issue than we make it here in the panel. And the line is not crystal clear. But you need to look at the function. What is the function? Is it it's something different between if it's in a airplane engine or if it's in a aesthetical product. So somewhere between those products, there is a line. And that is not a scientific line, of course. It's a political line. So you need to draw the line comparing the protection from the most hazardous chemicals that we identified, and we have just identified a few of them. There are so many more out there. So come on, the ones that we have identified, let's move forward with really protecting human health and environment from them. But that is also a policy decision. Where is that line? But it's not, you need to look at the function, not, I mean, is a color really important? Maybe, maybe not. But you need to look at the broader picture here.
One question on exactly that point also. We dealt with that under authorization, and very often while looking at the same question, we're asking ourselves, shouldn't those questions be addressed under restrictions? Because under a restriction, you're setting a line of what is an unacceptable risk. So here, there is a bit the struggling that we have. Is authorization really the right tool to determine what is acceptable from a societal point of view, or shouldn't that rather go under a restriction? I saw Fleur raised her hand, and I thought maybe I raised that in because she's also dealing with this question, should authorization or restrictions be the better tool? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I raised my hand to agree with Frida, and to add that the authorization process and the policy making that then leads to for an authorization to be granted also has this very strong time element in there, in which you can decide that when you have a necessary application that is vital for society, that you can leave that on the market for another 7 years or 12 years for the alternatives to develop, and then to reevaluate to see if it's still agreeable to keep it onto the market or to change to alternatives. And I think that's a very important thing that authorization facilitates. I think depending on the concern, you can have restriction if you have a clear understanding that a chemical can be used fully safe. And if it's the prospect that within now and a very long future there will be no alternatives, then restriction can be a good alternative for authorization, but that's a case-by-case decision.
Okay, that was clear. I'm now slowly going to move to the audience, inviting the audience to ask questions and give comments. In giving you a little bit of time to think about your question, there's one that I think I would also like to ask Tala here, is what are EPA's main ways of ensuring risks to workers are reduced? Is there also an encouragement of substitution? So do you also aim at substituting chemicals?
Yes, so we have some overlapping authorities here with our Occupational Safety and Health Administration in the protection of workers, but we ascribe, as they do, to the hierarchy of controls, and substitution is at the top of that list.
Okay, that's a good transition. We have 2 microphones on the 2 side corridors. So whoever is going to ask a question, I would like to ask to move to the nearest microphone. There is also the possibility to have a moving microphone in case that is actually needed. Maybe ask with the gentleman over there, and I ask you, Willem, to go to the other microphone in the meantime. Please.
Andrew Turley from Chemical Watch. I'm trying to remember my question because I actually wrote it down over there. So 2 questions. One is, what do you think the public understanding of socio-economic analysis is? So that's for the whole panel. I would suspect it's quite low compared with something like, say, risk assessment. If you explain, if you ask somebody about risk assessment, they would have a stab at what it means. I think they'd be much more confused about SEA. And if it is low, are you confident that the public would understand and react well to the authorization decisions that have already been made based on SEA? I think I know what Frida would say, but perhaps the rest of the panel.
Okay, well, on the socio-economic analysis, as I mentioned, many years we were Matti and I, we were among the first warriors for cost-benefit analysis, and we were looking with a lot of envy to the US and the UK, who had a lot of tools. But let me pass on the question to whoever wants to answer that. What does the public think about socioeconomic analysis? Does it understand it? Is it important? Maybe if I can add that question. Frida.
I think, I mean, now we have this as an element, but how it's used today, I don't think that the public would be very pleased, no. Because I think it's put too much emphasis on the economic side when we're talking about this substance of very high concern. So that's a short answer.
Tala, what does the US think about that?
Without getting too into how the public understands an economic analysis, I will say that in our experience, we have been mandated, both, as you saw, some provisions of TSCA require us to do that kind of thing, but also we have had an executive order in place for many years. So every rulemaking that we do in this specific context around potential restriction of chemical uses or whatever, there always is one accompanying. So again, this isn't a general public kind of read. It's fairly complicated and very long, usually, in our experience. But the interested stakeholders are very attuned to the fact that we always have one with our rulemakings and are quite familiar that it's there and contains a whole lot of analysis that it goes along to sort of describe the implications of the regulation.
Matti.
Actually, I don't think the public knows anything about risk assessment. I mean, that's the one that is, I think, the more complicated part. Actually, if you can communicate the results of a socioeconomic assessment, is kind of quite intuitive. I mean, should we use this chemical? The benefits of using this chemical are these. Say lead chromates. It's a beautiful, great pigment, right? It does a lot of good things, and at the same time it causes cancer. Okay, then there's a trade-off. And you just tell them what the information is, and then you go like, okay, this is what we're struggling with. And then people can make, that's the information, right? And then people make their own choices whether you should be using or not the chemical. And very often they choose not to, obviously, because they don't want to have the risk. But there might be situations where it is actually really, really needed, and then therefore you would actually, for instance, authorize the use. I'm not taking a stance on the lead chromates case now, but just you can actually make those trade-offs quite explicit. And if you are a good communicator, which usually public authorities are not, by the way, but that's a different thing. But if you're a good communicator, you can actually make the intuitive argument to the people and then make the trade-off more explicit.
So there was still the second question. What does the public think about the authorizations that we're giving, if I understood it correctly? And the question, yeah, Franz, thank you very much.
Yeah, just to be honest, a little bit echoing what Matti is saying. the public, the real public, not the interested stakeholders. They have no clue about what is authorization. I'm struggling on a daily basis to explain to my friends and family what I'm doing, to be honest. Therefore, there is really a communication issue here, not just about SCA or whatever. It's just what we are doing here with REACH in general, with the authorization process, with the risk assessment. The real public, the one that you cross in the street, they have no clue. That's really my experience on a daily basis.
Indeed, I also have very often difficulties to explain what REACH is. And when I worked on classification and labeling, I was much more happy because I could tell them that's the labels that you find on all the products. That is definitely true. But on the other hand, we also see a lot of interest in chemicals and an interest in specific issues sometimes coming up. So it's indeed a very difficult thing. But I don't want to take your time. Willem, please.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for a great discussion. My name is Willem Vriesendorp. I work with FIPRA. We do public affairs. And we've been representing the alternative providers to Chrome 6. Talking about authorization and maybe the need for more friends of authorization. A suggestion and maybe some sort of thought that I would like to have your views on. If alternative providers were enabled to provide themselves or to establish themselves earlier on in the process, would that not help everybody? I mean, if you're into an authorization process, you have paid a consultant, you have so many vested interests that you drive your own authorization through. If you can get sort of a communication going on before that, I think that would be a win-win for everybody. And that's what REACH should be really about, in my humble opinion. But maybe starting off with Matti, and then I would be very interested in the views of the rest of the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I guess the obvious complementer to this question is Frida. Can I ask you to comment, and then I will ask also France to react.
Yes, and thanks, Willem, for the question. And I think I put that in my speech before, that we also support this, that to start early in the process, to be able to be creative and not come into the panicking mode. That's very efficient. And I think it would be very useful for alternative providers to be connected with potential customers earlier in the process. And Chemsec has a great tool for this called the Marketplace. So check that out.
Thank you. I hope that everybody has heard that. Marketplace, Chemsec. France, please.
Okay, if we are in a promoting mode, let's go for the promotion of a tool of the industry. That's true that we need to be far more proactive. And for that, I quoted very quickly in my speech the mirror, what we call the mirror RMOA. The industry can have a look very early in the process. You have a substance of very high concern or potentially of very high concern with a difficult classification. You have to do your homework also at industry level. Look at what you have as data, look at what are the possible alternatives, and we know that it's tricky because as soon as you talk about it, of course, you touch very difficult business issues, but we did it in the metals industry several times. We are doing it. I gave the example of the lead, for example, in the precious metals. We are not blind with that. Therefore, using this tool, again, as industry, to be more proactive and to be in contact, using academics also to do that, it's really something that we would encourage as industry.
Thank you. 10 seconds for Matti, and I see there's already a queue. So I take the people who are still standing, but I don't want to make a lot of hopes for others. So if there's really something that is absolutely urgent, please do the queue quickly, but then I will not take any questions. Matti, please.
Absolutely agree, and the more we can do that, the better. The only thing is we are handicapped, of course, in ECHA we only have whatever we have as staff. We have a substitution strategy, and as part of that, we have that component included as well. 10 seconds over.
Thank you, Matti. Hugo, please.
Yeah, Hugo Waterschot from Eurometaux. One very quick comment and one quick question. The quick comment is about, do people understand SEA? No, actually the contrary. I give you an example. There were thousands of people interviewed in all the EU countries about if they want to switch to an electric car and under what conditions, because they were, for example, more silent, less CO2, etc. You know what the answer was? Yes, great idea if they are cheaper. It's exactly the opposite how they think. So no, they are not aware. My question is a little bit about that one. Retrospective assessments. We're used to do prospective assessments, but should we not systemically embed retrospective assessments into authorizations also and restrictions on a regular and actually objective-driven basis? Because that could prove if they were efficient or not, if we had the target or not. And would that, for example, not say, well, maybe with authorizations the problem is it goes for all the users instead of being selective for the users, you know? That comes back to the issue, don't we shoot with a cannon on a mosquito? Thank you for hearing your opinion.
Thank you. I'm tempted to answer myself, but Fleur, please.
Well, just to respond on this question, it's a very interesting thought, and we've discussed it at least also among member states, and Commission has been working on it as well, and maybe still working on it. I think one of the main difficulties with your proposal is that we lack any information about the baseline. We don't know the playfield that we're coming from, so it's very difficult to know the efficiency of where we're going at. And but it's definitely interesting to at least be able to set some elements, some indicators with which to measure at least part of the efficiency that we try to achieve.
Matti, quick reaction, please.
For restrictions, very difficult, but for applications for authorization, we actually have that system, Hugo, that you proposed. That's called the review reports. So when you actually when a company reapplies or makes a review report, it actually does its assessment of what's been going on. So I think your thought is actually quite good, and we should maybe even develop it a bit further together with industry, so that it becomes really kind of a retrospective analysis at the same time. Technology does evolve, and therefore things change quite rapidly.
Thank you, Matti. Ninja, please.
Yes, thank you. Ninja Reinige from ChemTrust. I agree the public does not understand authorization or a lot of the things we heard today, but what the public understands is that there are still many potentially harmful or known harmful chemicals in the products in their daily use. And there's a limitation of what you can do as an individual to avoid some of this contamination. So therefore, I would like to know from you, from the panel, what are your proposals for accelerating some of the risk management? Do we need a better complementarity of the tools, authorization, restriction, so that we really get a reduction of exposures in the daily use?
Who would like to answer first? Frida.
Thanks, Ninja, for the question. And I think first we need to accelerate the system we already have. We need more substances on the candidate list to be identified as substances of very high concern. We need more substances on Annex 14. So there is work to do just both for ECHA and the Commission and member states in this case. And I also think that tackling the problems with hazardous chemicals in products, I mean, then you really need to look into imported products. And I think for the future, we need to find a more efficient way to regulate the products coming into the EU. Also to be sure we have a good circular economy here.
Thank you, Frida. Fleur.
Yes, also thank you for your question. Maybe to add to Frida, is that for many of the substances for which we now have concern, that they are of a very high concern and should be out of these consumer products, we don't have the information yet to continue to processes like authorization, like restriction. And we first have to ask for further information from industry via the process of substance evaluation, for example, or via compliance checks to actually get the data with which to regulate these substances. So I think that's, at this moment, the most rate-limiting step.
Well, I'm actually sometimes quite unpopular among colleagues because I'm telling them we need to decide faster. And definitely, I think the speed with which we are dealing with things is an issue. And but for that, I think an important element is also to get a little bit more clarity, and I think that's where definitely struggling with those tools to get a decision what we do and then quickly go to the next step is an issue that we need to work on. The lady over there, please.
Wonderful. Thank you. My name is Carolyn Stwartka. I'm with Chemical and Material Risk Management Program at the U.S. Department of Defense. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the question that's up there because I wasn't the only one who had this question. So I'll just read it. It says, the U.S. EPA, in the selection of existing chemicals for risk evaluation, there does not always seem to be harmonization with the REACH substance of very high concern list. Or sometimes that might have to do with data availability. How much is the EPA looking into other lists, such as this global substance of very high concern list? And is there motivation to share data? Because the EU REACH program, as already was mentioned, has quite a bit of data. If I use two examples, PIP31 is regulated under TSCA, but is considered a substitute under REACH, and hexchrome is regulated under REACH, but is not yet regulated under US TSCA. Thank you.
Tala, I guess the question goes to you.
Okay, so what I can say is, yes, we do consider the European lists as well as many others, but on the flip side, I will tell you that, for example, the first 10 chemicals that we are doing risk evaluations for under the new TSCA are from this 2014 work plan of TSCA chemical assessments, and that is because the statute told us we must take those 10 from that list. That list is about 93 chemicals. Certainly some of them are on the SBHC list. Not all, I'm sure. You know, they don't overlap completely is what I'm saying. And also, so first and foremost, the chemical needs to be on the TSCA inventory. That's our universe. We also, as part of the new law, just undertook an activity to figure out of the 87,000 or so chemicals on that inventory, how many are commercially active. And just this February, we released that. So it's around over 40,000, but not 87,000. So we are focusing on the actives as well as a second cut. Third of all, there is that TSCA work plan. And as I mentioned, we had to take the first 10 from there by statute. And then we need to, at any given time, take 50% more from that list until that list is exhausted. This is mandated by the law. So we have another 20 that we're considering. We put out a list proposing candidates of 20 additional high priority. So in this first round of that, we did in fact take those 20 off that very same list, since we are obligated to complete that list as well. But when we arrayed, even back in 2012 when we came up with this list, we looked at all other jurisdictions' lists as well. It was part of the process of getting those chemicals on that list, was who's done something about it, which ones are on various lists, because again, we took sort of a risk-based approach to that list in the first place. So first and foremost, you had to have some data in order to evaluate the toxicity, the persistence, the bioaccumulation, and potential exposures. So we certainly do that. And then as far as data sharing, we are working very closely with ECHA, as well as with all of our OECD partners, to share data all the time. Certainly the ECHA database, which has been populated by the industry for registration, is extremely useful to us. But we're also sharing tools like Euclid and trying to make sure all the data that is in Euclid at ECHA, that we might also have that similar information. So in fact, we have a one-on-one relationship with ECHA as far as data sharing, not only the data per se, but the tools that have been developed there. So certainly we're wanting to share.
Thank you very much, Tala. We're actually have reached the time already, but I promised that I will take the last question. So please, very briefly, and also very brief answer then.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be as concise as possible. My name is Jochen van Brokke. I work as toxicologist at the European Chemicals Agency. Thank you, panelists, for creating this
state-of-the-art overview, especially with the last 10 years of REACH having been implemented and become part of the working tools that we have, restriction, authorization, in addition to the OELs. Now what I'm interested in, to which extent has authorization been considered as potential primus inter pares for the sustainability agenda? Simply seeing that authorization creates an inherent pressure for innovation that OELs and restrictions do not. Because as soon as a company, a workplace is compliant with the provisions set out therein, it's fine. Whereas an authorization is granted for a limited amount of time and then, well, there's a review. So is there a certain advantage for the future in authorizations?
I'm not so sure to what degree this is an open question. I think this was a comment, I think a very good and to the point comment that can help us. And I see that the contrary to where I started, from no friends of authorizations towards the few friends, I see indeed that I think today we've also learned that there's quite a lot we can get out of authorization. That in reality there's still quite a number of friends of authorization, and I see Matti's hand, so I think this is the final answer then.
No, it's an interesting question. I don't have the full answer, but I think we should not look at any of the instruments in isolation. First, they can work together like we have in authorization, also possibility to restrict imported, for instance, imported articles. The second one is that a restriction is very often reviewed, and therefore there is a possibility of sort of updating it as well. So it's not only in authorization you have that, and the same goes for OELs as well, any other legislation. So I don't think it's as static as you put it. I think there's dynamics which is different in authorization though, and I think that's good. The most important thing is that any of these tools, they are tools. Like restriction, I think, is like a hammer. And you can hit the nail, and that's great if you actually have a nail to hit. But if you hit your head, it's not a good thing to do. And same goes for authorization and any other things. So you really need to use the tools correctly as well, not only choose the right instrument. So that's something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Matti. Matti asked me before what I wanted to give as a final message out of this panel. I told him, no, I don't intend to give a message. I want people to be controversial so that we're hearing a lot of different views and ideas. And I would also like to let that stand like that. But what I do get as a conclusion is that we had a very interesting discussion, and I think we got a lot of elements and also new elements. Well, there was, for example, the suggestion to think more about ex-post evaluation. All that I think we can take up and take forward in our work, in your work. And I would like to thank you very much for this interesting discussion, and I wish you a very nice and fruitful continuation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Otto and the panelists. It sparked quite some discussion amongst yourself and amongst the public, and I hope you will continue over lunch. We'll have lunch now. The doors will be open on your left side, and we continue 1:15. So it's only 45 minutes or even less, because you ran over time a little bit, which is absolutely no problem. But you have to eat a little bit faster. Thank you, and see you back at 1:15. Thank you.